It was late afternoon in the deserts of North Africa. The golden hues of the sun were beginning to stretch long shadows across the arid landscape, the air thick with dust and the smell of burning oil. Colonel Dietrich von Schwartz, a veteran of the Afrika Korps, adjusted the goggles that shielded his eyes from the sun's relentless glare as he gazed over the convoy of captured U.S. trucks and jeeps strewn across the dirt road. The conquest had been swift, too swift. The supply dump they had discovered, however, had not been just a tactical victory. It had been a shock. It wasn't just the vehicles or the weapons they had seized, but the sheer scale of what the Americans had. Dietrich had seen many things in his time as a soldier. He had fought in the brutal desert battles alongside Rommel, fighting for survival in a land that seemed to stretch on forever. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, when he had been given command of a mission to capture a U.S. supply depot hidden deep within the sands. The discovery, however, was not of joy or excitement. It was of awe and disbelief. He had led his men to a seemingly ordinary outpost, only to find that within it lay more supplies, more fuel, and more ammunition than he could have ever imagined. As his men scoured the area, he stood, arms crossed, watching them move in and out of the structures, checking the crates marked with the bold, unmistakable U.S. insignia. But the one thing that struck him the hardest was the fuel. So much fuel. It was enough to sustain an entire army. Hell, it was enough to fuel an entire division for a month. And the Germans, they were always on a shortage of supplies. Their tanks sputtering through the desert on empty fuel tanks, their trucks limping across barren stretches of sand. And here, in front of him, was the realization of just how much they were up against. As the men worked, Dietrich couldn't shake the feeling of bitter irony. His division, the once proud Afrika Korps, had survived through sheer willpower. Rommel, their charismatic leader, had often spoken of fighting against the overwhelming odds of the British and later the Americans. But it wasn't the British that had caught his attention. It was the sheer power, the overwhelming industrial might of the United States. Standing beside a large crate of gasoline, Dietrich took a long drag from his cigarette. His mind wandered back to his own experiences in the desert. He thought of the endless resupply issues they had faced, the long stretches of barren desert where they had to make do with what little they had. They had rationed fuel, sometimes having to send men on foot to scavenge from the remains of abandoned vehicles after a battle. Yet here, just a few miles from their front line, lay more fuel than his entire division had seen in a month. He stepped forward to examine the large tankers, the gleaming trucks filled to the brim with precious fuel. The sight was almost too surreal. His mind flashed back to the supply issues they had suffered, their tanks grinding to a halt after hours of combat because they couldn't find fuel. He had seen men push their vehicles across the sand, their hands bleeding from the exertion because they couldn't afford to wait for supplies that always seemed to be out of reach. He thought about Rommel, the desert fox, and how much the man had pushed for more supplies, more resources. But here they were, an entire supply depot that could fuel not just his division, but an entire army, sitting in the middle of the North African desert. It was no wonder the Allies had an advantage in this war. The sheer scale of their resources was staggering.
The more Dietrich thought about it, the more his disbelief turned into frustration. The Germans had always fought with innovation, with determination, with the belief that they could overcome any obstacle through skill and resourcefulness. But now, standing in front of crates and tanks of fuel, he realized something. The U.S. had the one thing the Germans couldn't match: resources, and they had plenty of it. As his men loaded the supplies into their trucks, Dietrich turned to his sergeant, Friedrich, who was watching the operation with a stoic face. "This is the problem, Friedrich," Dietrich said, his voice quiet but sharp. "We've been fighting a war of attrition, and the Americans, they don't play by the same rules. They don't care about attrition. They just have everything." Friedrich nodded, his eyes scanning the rows of supplies. "They've got the entire world behind them," he replied grimly. "We've got, what, the Reich? Our allies?" Dietrich clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the words. The Germans had fought and bled for every inch of territory, while the Americans seemed to simply pour endless supplies into their campaigns, reinforcing their positions at every turn. The weeks after the supply dump were marked with an eerie sense of unease for Dietrich and his men. They had captured an incredible amount of resources, but it was clear that this one victory, while significant, had come too late in the war. The tides had already begun to turn. As he watched his division struggle to move forward, Dietrich found himself questioning everything he had fought for. The Germans had long prided themselves on their superior tactics and their military ingenuity. Yet here were the Americans throwing vast quantities of resources into their campaigns, overwhelming their enemies without ever having to worry about running out of supplies. Heinz, one of Dietrich's lieutenants, came up to him one evening as they sat around a small fire. The men had just finished loading the last of the fuel and supplies into their trucks, and now they were preparing to move out. "It doesn't seem fair, Colonel," Heinz said, his voice weary. "We fight for every drop of fuel, every bullet, but they just keep coming, more and more. We can't keep up." Dietrich took a deep breath, watching the flames dance in the fire. "It's not about fairness, Heinz," he replied, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. "It's about endurance. They have the resources, the manpower. They're playing a different game, and we're losing." Heinz was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. The truth of Dietrich's words hung in the air like a cloud. The war, which had once seemed so winnable, was now slipping away from them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As the war drew to a close, Dietrich found himself reflecting on his role in it all. He had been a part of one of the most formidable fighting forces in history, but he had also been a part of a cause that had ultimately doomed itself. The resources, the manpower, the supplies. These were things that could not be overcome by strategy alone. The U.S. had proven that in North Africa, just as they would prove it in the Pacific and Europe. It wasn't about tactics. It wasn't about bravery. It was about what you had and how you used it. And in that, the Americans had outmatched them. Dietrich sat in the quiet of his tent, looking at the map of Europe on the wall. The war was over. Germany had lost. The Afrika Korps had been defeated. And as he looked at the empty spaces on the map, he understood something. It was no longer about the battlefield. It was about survival. The U.S. had fought not just with their military, but with their economy, with their industry, and with their boundless resources. And in the end, that was what made the difference.
Years later, Dietrich would look back on those days in the desert and think of the men he had fought beside, the men who had died, the men who had survived. He would remember the sight of the massive U.S. supply dumps, the fuel that seemed to stretch forever. But what he remembered most was the quiet realization that the war had not been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost long before, in the factories, in the supply lines, in the infrastructure that the Americans had built up over decades. They had built a war machine that could never be stopped, no matter how skilled their enemies were. And for Dietrich, that realization was a bitter one. They had fought with courage, with valor, but they had been outmatched by a country whose industrial power was beyond anything they could comprehend. The years after the war were filled with strange quietness. Dietrich, like so many others, found himself in the disarray of a defeated country. Germany had been reduced to rubble, its cities shattered, its military broken, and its people struggling to rebuild in the aftermath of a war that had consumed everything. Dietrich had returned home, but the man who returned was not the man who had left. The uniform, the medals, the pride, all of it seemed so far away now, irrelevant in the face of a world that had moved on without them. He spent his days in the ruins of Berlin,
trying to find work, trying to find meaning in a life that had been turned upside down. The harsh reality of post-war Germany was more brutal than the desert heat he had once fought in. The streets were empty, and the few shops that were still open were filled with only the barest necessities. People were hungry. People were broken. And Dietrich, once a proud officer in the Afrika Korps, found himself trying to navigate the wreckage of his own country. He walked through the streets, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the ruins of the city. It was impossible to recognize the place he had once called home. The landmarks, the buildings, the life, everything had been lost. And in the quiet of those moments, as he walked through the debris, he began to think more and more about his time as a prisoner of war. What he had learned in the American POW camp was something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It wasn't just the ice cream or the fuel dumps. It was the realization that the war had never been about skill, bravery, or honor. It had been about resources. The United States, with its immense industrial power, had simply overwhelmed their enemies with sheer volume. And Dietrich had been caught in that wave, struggling to hold on to a sinking ship while the Americans sailed forward unchallenged. He thought of the men in the camp, the American soldiers who had treated them with respect, and even in some strange way, with kindness. They had been enemies, yet there had been a humanity in the way they had treated him and his comrades. It was a stark contrast to the ideology that he had been raised with, the ideology that had glorified the concept of the superior race and the master people. That world, that way of thinking had been destroyed by the war, just as Germany had been destroyed. As Dietrich thought more about it, he began to question everything he had once believed. The Reich, with its promises of glory and greatness, had fallen. The soldiers, the officers, and the civilians, who had all been taught to believe in the superiority of their cause, were now left to pick up the pieces of a broken world. But what had they fought for? What had they hoped to achieve? The reality of it all began to sink in. The war was an illusion, a lie, built on propaganda and false promises. And now all that was left were the survivors, the men and women who had to live with the aftermath.
One afternoon, Dietrich sat at a small cafe in Berlin, watching the people pass by. It was a quiet place, far from the chaotic streets where the real devastation of the war was still visible. He sipped his coffee, lost in thought, when an older man, one he vaguely recognized, came up to him and took a seat across from him. "Colonel von Schwartz, isn't it?" the man asked, his voice rough, worn by age and hardship. Dietrich looked at him, trying to place his face. "Yes, I think so," he replied. "Do we know each other?" The man smiled faintly. "I was at the front with you, before it all went to hell. I was with the Luftwaffe, a radio operator." The recognition hit Dietrich like a wave. He remembered the man now. They had fought together in the skies, had shared the same bitter taste of defeat. The man was just one of the many faces from the past that had been wiped out in the chaos of war. "I heard you came back from the Americans' camp. You've seen what we've all become. The war is over, but the damage is beyond repair." Dietrich nodded silently. What could he say? How could he explain what he had learned from the other side, from the enemy? How could he put into words the profound shift in perspective he had experienced, the shock of realizing that the real enemy had not been the soldiers across the battlefield, but the forces of history, the greed of those who had manipulated entire nations into war for their own gain? "I saw what they had," Dietrich said slowly, his voice strained. "The fuel dumps, the supplies, more than we could ever dream of. The war was never about tactics.
It was about resources. And we were doomed from the start. The man across from him nodded gravely. You think we could have won if we had more resources? If we didn't have to ration every bullet, every gallon of fuel? Dietrich looked out the window, staring at the bleak, rubble-strewn streets. No. The war wasn't about who was better at fighting. It was about who could outlast the other. And in the end, we didn't have the means to keep up. The Americans had factories, they had resources. They could produce more than we ever could, and they never had to worry about running out. That's the truth of it. The man sat back in his chair, eyes distant as he thought about Dietrich's words. I wonder what our grandfathers would say. They fought in the Great War, and they thought it was the war to end all wars. But we've learned something different, haven't we? Dietrich didn't answer immediately. The thought of his grandfather, a soldier who had fought in the trenches of World War I, filled him with a deep sorrow. The generations of soldiers who had lived and died for causes they believed in, only to be told that their sacrifice had been for nothing. The world had changed, and the old ideals of honor and glory seemed like relics of a time that no longer existed. After a long silence, Dietrich spoke again. It's not about honor anymore, not about glory. It's about survival. We survived, but at what cost? As the conversation came to an end, Dietrich stepped out into the streets of Berlin once more, feeling the weight of his past settle around him like a heavy cloak. The city was still recovering, still finding its way through the wreckage. But for Dietrich, the real question had become, how do you rebuild when the foundations of everything you believed in have been torn apart? The old world had been lost in the fire of war, and the new one was still taking shape. There was no map to follow, no blueprint for how to move forward. All he had was the quiet understanding that things could never go back to the way they were. The world was changing, and he had to change with it. And as he walked through the rubble of Berlin, Dietrich realized that the true cost of the war had not been measured in land conquered or battles won. It had been measured in the destruction of the ideals that had once guided them. The war had been a test of endurance, of survival, and now, in the aftermath, the real battle was just beginning. The battle to understand what it meant to live in a world where the old rules no longer applied.
Years passed and Dietrich found his place in post-war Germany. The country had been divided, the scars of the war still raw. He worked in construction, helping to rebuild what was left of Berlin. The city, like him, was a shadow of its former self, but it was also something new, something different. And as Dietrich worked alongside men who had been both enemies and comrades, he realized something else. The war, with all its horrors, had taught them one crucial lesson. It was a lesson not of victory or defeat, but of understanding. Understanding that no matter where they came from, no matter what they had fought for, they were all human beings. The war had torn them apart, but now they were rebuilding, together. The workdays were long and exhausting, the type of labor that numbed the mind and wore down the body. Dietrich spent most of his time with other men, some veterans of the war, others just regular workers trying to put together the broken pieces of a shattered country. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when he caught himself lost in thought, staring at the remains of Berlin's once mighty skyline, now reduced to rubble. The city was a symbol of both defeat and resilience, as if it mirrored Dietrich's own soul, broken but still breathing. He thought often about the days before the war, before the insanity of it all took hold. When he was a boy, he had believed in ideals, duty, honor, country. He had been taught to love his homeland, to fight for it, to defend it against any threat. But those ideals had been shattered in the brutal reality of war, and now Dietrich found himself questioning everything. What was honor now? What was duty? The war had shown him the cost of blind loyalty,
the devastation that followed when men followed orders without understanding the true consequences. And now, in the quiet of the Reconstruction, in the streets where echoes of battle still lingered, Dietrich was forced to face the uncomfortable truth that the very things he had fought for had led to destruction. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the broken walls of Berlin, Dietrich found himself at a local pub, sitting with a few of his comrades. They were all soldiers at one point, though some had been on the other side. Some had fought for the Allies, while others had served in the Wehrmacht. Now they sat together as civilians, bound not by the uniform they once wore, but by the shared experience of war. The pub was small, the air thick with the smell of beer and cigarette smoke. The walls were lined with photographs of old Berlin, taken before the war. The faces in the photographs were unfamiliar, but the pride in their eyes was unmistakable. As Dietrich raised his glass to drink, one of the men, Klaus, a former Luftwaffe officer, spoke up. His voice was heavy with regret, but there was a bitter humor to it. "You ever wonder, Dietrich," Klaus said, looking into his beer, "if we'd have won if we'd had more of what the Americans had? More resources, more industry, more fuel, more everything?" Dietrich set his glass down slowly, considering the question. He had thought about that very thing 1,000 times in the years since the war ended. The realization was hard to swallow, but it was true. The Germans had fought with everything they had, but in the end it wasn't enough. The war was never about which side had the better fighters, the better generals. It was about who could outlast the other, who could bring more to the battlefield. And in that respect, the United States had won the war long before the first shots were fired in Europe. "We didn't lose because we weren't good enough," Dietrich said quietly, his voice laced with a hint of bitterness. "We lost because we didn't have what they had. Not the weapons, not the tactics. We lost because they could replace everything we lost. Every tank, every plane, every bullet. They could replace it, no matter how many we destroyed." Klaus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at his beer, lost in thought. It was a truth that no one in Germany was willing to admit for a long time. But Dietrich had come to understand it in the quiet after the war. It wasn't just the military power that had been the deciding factor. It was the sheer weight of American industrial might, the factories, the workers, the raw materials that fed into the war machine. They had endless supplies, while the Germans had scraped by on rationed goods.
As the weeks passed, Dietrich tried to make peace with this new reality. The world he had once known, the ideals he had once fought for, were gone. Germany, like the rest of Europe, was rebuilding, but the scars of war ran deep. People were trying to move on, to find new purpose in the face of all they had lost, but the weight of the past was hard to shake. Dietrich began to do what many others had done, try to find meaning in the small things. He worked on the construction project, helping to rebuild homes and businesses. He found solace in the simplicity of the work, in the rhythm of laying bricks and cement. It wasn't the most glamorous of tasks, but it was something. It was a way to make his mark, to contribute to a country that was slowly rising from the ashes. But there were days when Dietrich would sit alone in his small apartment, staring out the window at the rubble of the city, and wonder if he would ever truly escape the ghosts of the past. His mind would drift to the camp, to the faces of the American soldiers who had treated him with surprising dignity. He would think of the ice cream, the simple act of kindness that had forced him to confront his own humanity. And in those moments, Dietrich felt a deep ache, a longing for something that no longer existed, something that had been lost in the flames of war. One evening, as Dietrich walked through the streets of Berlin, he found himself standing in front of the remains of the Reichstag once again. The building, which had been the symbol of Nazi power, now stood as a hollow shell of its former self. The war had taken everything from it, from Germany. He stood there for a long time, watching the remnants of the building as the shadows of the night crept in. He thought of his time as a soldier, of the men he had commanded, of the battles he had fought. And he thought of the Americans, their power, their industry, their ability to rebuild after everything they had lost. The contrast between Germany and America seemed more stark than ever. Dietrich's thoughts turned to the future. What kind of world would emerge from the ashes of war?
What kind of Germany would rise from the rubble? And more importantly, what kind of man would he be when it was all over? He had been a soldier, part of something much larger than himself. But now, with the war behind him, he had to find a new purpose, a new identity. And that, more than anything, was the true battle he faced. The years went by and Dietrich, like many of his fellow countrymen, tried to make a life in a Germany that was no longer the one he had known. It wasn't easy. The country was fractured, both physically and psychologically. The scars of the war ran deep, and every corner of Berlin seemed to hold a memory of the past, a reminder of the devastation that had been wrought. But slowly, as the world moved forward, Dietrich began to find peace in the small things. He had made his peace with the past, or at least with the parts of it he could control. He had learned, in a way, to forgive himself for the role he had played in the war. The guilt would never go away, but he had come to understand that it was part of the price he had to pay. In the end, Dietrich realized that the war had been a lesson, not just in tactics and strategy, but in the true cost of conflict. It wasn't just the lives lost on the battlefield. It was the lives broken by the aftermath, the men who had fought for ideals that no longer made sense, the countries that had been destroyed by ambition and greed. And most importantly, it was the understanding that no matter who won or lost, the true cost of war was never fully paid in victory. It was paid in the quiet, empty spaces left behind after the fighting had stopped.
As Dietrich sat in his modest home, watching the news of the world, he thought back to his time as a soldier, to the battlefields of North Africa, to the supply dumps, to the endless desert, to the men he had fought beside and the ones he had lost. The world had changed, and so had he. The war had taken much from him, but it had also given him something. It had given him a deeper understanding of the world, of the fragility of life, of the importance of peace. And as the world moved on, Dietrich knew that he too would have to move on. But he would never forget what he had learned, the lessons that could only come from surviving a war. He would carry them with him for the rest of his life, as a reminder of the cost of conflict and the price of peace. The years following the war had not been easy for Dietrich, but he had somehow found a way to survive in the ruins of a broken Germany. Berlin was still struggling to recover, its streets lined with makeshift buildings, crumbling monuments, and vacant spaces that once held life. But in the midst of this devastation, there was something else: resilience. Dietrich had seen it in his fellow Germans, in the faces of the men and women who had also endured the war. They were rebuilding, slowly, brick by brick. But they were rebuilding. Yet for Dietrich, there was no easy return to normality. He was not the same man who had marched into North Africa, so sure of himself, so proud of his role in the great cause of the Reich. Now, he was simply another man trying to figure out what it meant to be human in a world that had lost its way. He continued to work, helping to rebuild what had been destroyed. The construction projects were a far cry from the combat missions he had once led, but they gave him a sense of purpose, something to occupy his mind during the long, lonely days. He worked alongside other men, some who had fought for the Allies, some who had been his comrades in arms, and others who had never fought at all. One afternoon, as Dietrich was putting in another day's work on a new housing project, he found himself sitting with a group of men, taking a short break from the labor. A man named Hans, who had been a prisoner of war in the U.S., spoke up. "I never thought I'd see the day, Dietrich," he said, his voice weary but sincere. "I thought the war would go on forever. I thought the Reich would rise again. But here we are, trying to rebuild what we've lost. We're not the men we once were. We're just survivors now." Dietrich nodded. taking a long drag from his cigarette. "We all thought it was for something bigger," he said quietly, looking out across the ruins of the city. "But it was all just smoke and mirrors. The war, the ideals, everything we believed in. It was all built on lies." Hans looked at him, his eyes narrowing as if considering Dietrich's words. "You think we fought for nothing? All those men? All those sacrifices? Was it for nothing?" Dietrich thought for a moment, the weight of the question pressing on him. "I don't know. I don't know what it was all for. But I do know one thing. We weren't fighting for what we thought we were fighting for. The world doesn't work like that. No one wins a war. We're all left with the wreckage. All we can do now is pick up the pieces." Hans didn't reply. He just looked down at his hands, his fingers stained from the work, his body weathered by the years of hardship. Life in the years after the war became a strange, slow march forward for Dietrich. He often found himself reflecting on his time as a soldier, the choices he had made, and the life he had lost. But there were also moments of connection, moments that made him realize that even in the aftermath of war, human bonds could still form, even between former enemies. One evening, as Dietrich worked late at the construction site, he found himself face to face with a young American soldier. The man was in his mid-20s, a few years younger than Dietrich, and had been stationed in Germany after the war. The soldier had been tasked with overseeing some of the rebuilding efforts, and it had been Dietrich's responsibility to guide him through the process. At first, Dietrich had been wary of the American. The young man's uniform, his accent, his culture, it all reminded Dietrich of the war, of the men that he had fought against, of the very conflict that had torn apart his life. But as time went on, Dietrich found himself surprisingly comfortable in the soldier's presence. They had conversations about the war, about life, about what they had lost, and Dietrich began to realize that in some strange way, this young American soldier had become something of a companion. One night, after a long day of work, Dietrich and the American soldier, whose name was Michael, sat on the roof of a partially rebuilt apartment building, drinking beer and watching the sunset over the ruins of Berlin. "Funny, isn't it?" Michael said, breaking the silence. "How we end up here, in this place, talking like we're friends. I don't know what to make of it." "It's strange, isn't it? We were enemies not so long ago, and now here we are, sitting together in a city that's lost everything. But I think we've all lost something, haven't we?" Michael nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, we all lost something. But the thing is, we're here now. We survived. And maybe that's what matters. The rest of it, the war, the death, the destruction, it's all behind us. All we have now is the future." Dietrich took a deep breath, letting the words sink in. He looked out over the city, at the buildings that were slowly rising from the rubble, at the people who were trying to rebuild their lives. "You're right. We survived. But what comes after survival?" Michael turned to look at him, his expression earnest. I think we build something new, something different from the past. We can't go back. We can't undo the war, but we can make sure it never happens again. Maybe that's the only thing worth fighting for now. Peace.
The next few years were quiet for Dietrich. The war was over, but the battle to rebuild his life, his identity, was just beginning. He continued to work on various projects, helping with the construction of Berlin. But it wasn't just buildings that were being rebuilt. Dietrich had to rebuild himself, too. The ideals he had once held so fiercely had been shattered. But in their place, something new was growing, a recognition of humanity, of what it meant to live in a world of peace, and the understanding that the past could never be forgotten, but it could be learned from. Dietrich never forgot the lessons he learned in those quiet moments, sitting with Michael, talking about life in the aftermath of war. The war had been an experience that had defined him, but it was no longer the only thing that defined him. Now he looked to the future, to the possibility of a world that could move beyond the mistakes of the past. And so, Dietrich moved forward. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of the past threatened to crush him, days when the memories of the war seemed too overwhelming to bear. But with each passing day, as the world rebuilt itself, as Germany found its place in the post-war order, Dietrich found that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to move on, to find peace, not just in the world, but within himself. As the years rolled by, Dietrich found solace in the small, quiet moments of life. The rebuilding continued, the wounds of war slowly healing, and Berlin, though still scarred, began to rise again, piece by piece. The landscape was changing, both literally and metaphorically. The ideals Dietrich had once fought for had crumbled, but in their place he found a new understanding, a recognition of the importance of peace, the value of human connection, and the need to ensure that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. In the end, Dietrich's journey was not about redemption or victory, it was about survival. And survival, he had learned, wasn't just about enduring. It was about learning, adapting, and finding new meaning in a world that had been shattered by war. And as the sun set over Berlin, casting long shadows over the city, Dietrich knew that his story, like the story of Germany, was one of survival, of resilience, and of hope for a future that could rise from the ashes of the past.